One of the biggest debates surrounding AI right now is whether it will ultimately help humanity or harm it. A recent paper by Nobel Prize-winning economist Daron Acemoglu and co-authors offers a new insight into that question. The authors argue that under certain conditions, increasingly accurate AI could eventually cause what they refer to as a knowledge collapse. To understand what this means, I'm going to walk you through the paper using a well-known medical example from the 1980s. In June 1981, several young men arrived at hospitals suffering from a rare form of pneumonia. Normally, this infection was only seen in patients with severely weakened immune systems. Around the same time, doctors elsewhere in California and New York were beginning to observe unusually aggressive cases of Kaposi sarcoma, a rare cancer that had historically been seen mostly in elderly men. One of the doctors involved in treating these patients was Michael Gottlieb, an immunologist at UCLA Medical Center. Dr. Gottlieb, like every physician around him, had spent years studying anatomy, immunology, germ theory, virology, oncology, and infectious diseases. They had learned about these topics from the body of medical knowledge available at the time. This knowledge was society's attempt to understand the ever-evolving underlying medical reality, what the authors refer to as the common state. Not only did Dr. Gottlieb and his colleagues rely on this understanding of medical knowledge, but they also relied on information about the patients themselves, such as the patient's symptoms, medical history, and test results. Neither type of knowledge is sufficient on its own. A doctor needs both broad medical knowledge and careful investigation of the patient sitting in front of them in order to make an accurate diagnosis. The doctor is trying to make two predictions at once. First, a prediction about the patient in front of them, such as what condition they have and how they should be treated. But second, a prediction about the broader state of the world. Is this just an isolated case of a rare disease, or evidence that something in the medical environment has changed? The quality of the payoff, in this case the effectiveness of the treatment, depends on getting both reasonably right. These cases in the 1980s baffled Gottlieb and his colleagues. They were desperate to understand what was going on, and so they began investigating these cases. Doctors discussed unusual symptoms with colleagues, they compared patient histories, they published case reports, debated possible explanations, and they searched for patterns linking patients across different hospitals and cities. All of this required immense effort which could otherwise be spent elsewhere, such as on other patients. This effort generated two things simultaneously. First, it helped the doctor better understand the patient sitting in front of them. But because that investigation also revealed something about the disease itself, it generated information that future doctors could learn from. In economics, we call this a positive externality. The new information learned by this doctor would be added to the total body of knowledge that exists, and therefore, future doctors would now inherit a slightly better understanding of the world. Over time, given the combined effort of countless doctors and researchers, it became clear that these patients were not simply suffering from isolated cases of rare diseases. Instead, they were the earliest known cases of a new disease: AIDS. To understand how AI could lead to a knowledge collapse, let's imagine that the AIDS epidemic did not occur in 1981. Instead, it first appears in the year 2050. Just like in our timeline, a young, previously healthy man begins feeling unwell and eventually admits himself to the emergency room of his local hospital. He has unusual purple lesions on his skin, persistent fatigue, and difficulty breathing. Sitting around him in the waiting room are dozens of other patients. Some have already been waiting for hours. Eventually, the patient is called into the doctor's office and he explains his symptoms. The doctor enters his details into an AI assistant, and within seconds it suggests a diagnosis. It suggests that the patient has Kaposi sarcoma. The doctor is initially taken aback. She remembers Kaposi sarcoma from medical school, but historically it was mostly seen in older patients, not young, otherwise healthy people. Still, the AI system is usually extremely accurate, and so the doctor sends the patient for further testing. A few hours later, the test comes back positive. The doctor is still confused, but she has an important choice to make. She could spend several more hours gathering additional information about this patient, or she can move on, relying on the information she already has from her own examination, the laboratory tests, and the AI system. You see, every additional hour the doctor spends investigating generates more information about the patient's condition. In 1981, this was the only way to improve her understanding of the patient. But in 2050, much of that information has already been provided by the AI system. Importantly, each additional piece of information becomes less valuable than the last. The first few clues dramatically improve the doctor's understanding of the patient, but by the 20th blood test or the 10th specialist opinion, another hour of investigation is much less likely to change the diagnosis or treatment. The AI has already provided many of those valuable early pieces of information instantly. As a result, every additional hour of the doctor's own investigation now produces a smaller improvement in understanding than it would have in 1981. And so, instead of spending as much additional time investigating the anomaly as a doctor might have in 1981, she admits the patient to the oncology ward and moves on. However, the same process repeats itself all across the country. In Los Angeles, another doctor encounters a patient with a rare pneumonia. In New York, another otherwise healthy young man develops Kaposi sarcoma. Each time, the AI provides a highly accurate assessment, the patient receives treatment, and the doctor moves on. But because doctors now spend less time investigating unusual cases, fewer case reports are written, fewer connections are made across hospitals, and less new medical knowledge is created. As a result, the collective stock of medical knowledge may no longer keep pace with a changing medical environment. Knowledge has an amazing property in that it helps to facilitate the creation of more knowledge. The more doctors understand about the world, the easier it becomes to recognize when something doesn't fit existing patterns, and the easier it becomes to justify spending time investigating those anomalies. Agentic AI changes this trade-off. Because the AI already provides highly accurate patient-specific information, the marginal benefit of the doctor's own investigation begins to fall, and this creates a vicious cycle. So as doctors rely more heavily on AI, they investigate less. Less investigation produces less new public knowledge, leaving future doctors with a weaker understanding of the world. They, in turn, have even less of an incentive to investigate. With AI, medicine becomes extremely efficient at treating the diseases it already understands, but progressively worse at discovering new diseases. But medicine is just one example. The model is intended to describe any environment where solving problems also creates knowledge that others later build upon. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing. It might sound like the model is predicting a slow and inevitable decline in society's knowledge, but that's not actually what the authors find. Instead, the model predicts that two very different long-run outcomes are possible. In outcome A, society settles into a so-called high knowledge equilibrium. Doctors continue investigating unusual cases, new discoveries keep accumulating, and each generation inherits a richer understanding of the world than the last. In outcome B, society falls into what the authors call a knowledge collapse equilibrium. New discoveries become increasingly rare, and the stock of shared knowledge gradually becomes less accurate as the world continues to change. For instance, new diseases begin to emerge. Therefore, each generation inherits a worse understanding of the world than the generation before them. So what determines which future we end up in? According to the model, one of the most important factors determining which future emerges is the precision of the AI system itself. At lower levels of AI precision, society can still sustain the high knowledge equilibrium. Doctors continue generating enough new knowledge to keep the learning process alive, even if AI has reduced their incentive to investigate. But as the AI becomes increasingly accurate, the model reaches a critical threshold. Beyond this level of AI precision, the marginal benefit of additional investigation becomes so low that doctors no longer generate enough new knowledge to sustain the learning process. The high knowledge equilibrium disappears entirely. From this point onward, the model predicts that the only remaining long-run outcome is the knowledge collapse equilibrium. No matter how much knowledge society has accumulated in the past, each generation now produces too little new knowledge to keep up with the changing state of the world. It's important to note that this does not imply a collapse in medical treatment. Doctors do not suddenly become incompetent, nor does the AI stop working. The collapse occurs in society's ability to generate new general knowledge. As the true state of the world changes, for instance through the emergence of a new disease, society is no longer able to collectively identify and understand those changes. So does the model imply that a knowledge collapse is inevitable? Not necessarily. The authors identify another factor that pushes in the opposite direction, and in classic Acemoglu fashion, this factor is related to institutions. It is the ability of society to collect, share, and build upon knowledge. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, doctors rarely communicate with one another. Research findings remain isolated within individual hospitals, case reports are difficult to find, and valuable insights are frequently lost. In the second scenario, doctors publish their findings, they attend conferences, share data, debate unusual cases, and contribute to a large body of publicly accessible medical knowledge. In this scenario, discoveries made by one doctor can rapidly be learned by thousands of others. The model refers to this as the aggregation capacity, essentially how effectively society converts individual discoveries into shared knowledge. Importantly, greater aggregation capacity makes a knowledge collapse less likely. The reason is relatively straightforward. If knowledge spreads more effectively, then each hour spent investigating an unusual case produces a larger benefit for society as a whole. Future doctors inherit a richer understanding of the world, making it easier for them to recognize new phenomena and contribute knowledge of their own. In other words, while agentic AI reduces the incentive to produce knowledge, stronger institutions can increase society's ability to preserve and distribute the knowledge that is produced. So far we've been discussing a theoretical model, but the authors also point to several real-world examples that may already resemble the mechanism we've just described. For example, consider Stack Overflow, a website where programmers ask questions, share solutions, and collectively build a public repository of knowledge. Since the arrival of large language models, new contributions to the platform have fallen dramatically. Fewer questions are being asked, fewer answers are being written, and therefore, less new knowledge is being added to the system. This looks eerily similar to what the model predicts. Programmers can now obtain useful answers directly from AI systems, reducing the incentive to contribute to the public stock of knowledge in the first place. The concern isn't that programmers become less productive today. In fact, it's likely that way more code is being written on a daily basis compared to before the advent of LLMs. The concern is that fewer people contribute to the knowledge that future programmers and future AI systems will rely upon. I should add that the effect of LLMs on Stack Overflow is still debated. For instance, some argue that the culture on Stack Overflow had resulted in a decline in usage prior to the release of ChatGPT. While discussing this paper, we've seen that more accurate AI has both benefits and costs. It improves decision making today, but it can also reduce society's incentive to generate the knowledge that future generations will depend upon. This raises the question of what we, or maybe more accurately what policymakers, can do about this. Given what we've seen today, the socially optimal level of AI accuracy may not be the maximum possible level of AI accuracy. The authors therefore give a surprising suggestion. Rather than always providing users with the most precise recommendation possible, AI systems could sometimes be deliberately designed to leave room for human investigation and learning. They refer to this idea as information garbling. In other words, the goal would no longer be to maximize the accuracy of every individual recommendation. Instead, it would be to maximize society's ability to continue generating new knowledge over the long run. However, whether such policies are practical remains an open question. For instance, this would presumably be very difficult to regulate. Before we finish, it's worth remembering that this paper is a theoretical model, not an empirical paper. The authors are not claiming to provide causal evidence that this is happening. They are using mathematics to explore what could happen under a particular set of assumptions. Like any theoretical model, it's also possible that the authors have omitted relevant variables. In other words, they've left out things that might also affect the probability of a knowledge collapse. For instance, my understanding is that they do not account for the innate curiosity of humans, a characteristic that I believe is one of the many defining features of humanity. People might continue investigating unusual problems out of pure curiosity. I also wonder how incentive structures would change. Governments, hospitals, or pharmaceutical companies all have a strong incentive to detect new diseases early. They may therefore create incentives for doctors, such as through bonuses or promotions, to continue spending time investigating unusual cases. Therefore, I think it's better to view the paper as a warning about a mechanism that could exist and one that may become increasingly important as AI systems continue to improve. Whether that mechanism turns out to be large enough to matter in practice is ultimately an empirical question. However, when the stakes are this high, the importance of preemptive theoretical work becomes clear. Before wrapping up, there's another factor that the authors consider that is important to mention. What if future AI systems begin generating new knowledge themselves? The authors model this possibility using what they call synthetic data. Interestingly, they find that the basic mechanism still survives, provided AI-generated knowledge is not a perfect substitute for human learning. In that case, AI can partially offset the decline in human knowledge production, making a complete collapse less likely, but it doesn't eliminate the underlying problem. If human learning continues to fall, society can still converge to a much lower level of collective knowledge. The jury is still out on the effect that AI will have on humanity. Regardless of whether the predictions made in this paper turn out to be right or wrong, I think it asks an important question. We often evaluate AI by asking whether it helps us make better decisions, improves our productivity, or simply makes our lives easier today. But this paper reminds us that AI may also affect the rate at which society generates the new knowledge that future generations and future AI systems themselves will ultimately rely upon. Knowledge has to be continuously created and built upon. It is the product of millennia of human effort. If this paper is correct, then despite being a remarkable human innovation, AI could ultimately undermine the very process of human innovation itself. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might also enjoy this video on why half of you shouldn't exist. Or, if today's discussion about the AIDS epidemic was of interest, I made an entire video on the Ryan White Care Act, one of the most successful public health programs in American history. It should be visible on screen now. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time on Econ Unpacked.